I'm John, and tonight I want answers about transgender people. My guest tonight is Lisa Lippincott. Thanks for being on the show, Lisa.
You're welcome.
Lisa is my expert tonight because she's a transgender woman. So what's the correct terminology? Now, we kind of rehearsed before the show, and I guess transgender people is what we agreed on. Before that, I was saying transgendered American, which is wrong on multiple counts, right?
Well, I am an American also. And,
yes, but transgenderism is not exclusive to Americans.
True.
And transgender is not a verb.
Transgender, pretty much not a verb. You don't have to put ed on the end of it, though you see that sometimes.
Yeah.
It's an adjective. People use trans for short.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's a lot more convenient than having how many syllables that is. I don't know.
But then people might get confused, like trans what?
Yes, it could be. I could be a transcontinental person, but.
So let's understand what it means. What does transgender person mean?
Transgender person means I was raised as a male, found out that wasn't really for me, and decided to become female. And so what I've done is crossed gender. It's Greek, you see. Trans is crossing.
Ah, I was going to ask about that. I thought it was transcended gender.
Well, there might be a little bit of that in it too, but really crossing.
So transgender and trans is the correct terms to use.
Yes.
Now there's incorrect terms to use.
Yes.
I think the slang tranny, which is we stay away from.
Not considered nice.
Is it because of historical reasons, or because when people use it, they're not pure of heart?
I think that there's a certain amount of both. I think that, you know, you can get away with a lot if you smile when you say this, and you know, we know you have the right attitude. But really, I think it's the porn connection that makes it get on a lot of people's nerves.
Oh.
And any word that you're more likely to see on the box of a porn video than used in the newspaper. It's probably one that you don't want to describe people with most of the time.
Right. I've heard of like cross-dressers and drag queens and transvestites. Would you consider them to be transgender?
They're, in the broad term, yes. So anything that really mixes up gender is can be considered transgender, and people are usually only considered transgender if they do it a lot.
Okay.
So, for example, you know, in some ways you could consider if you think that it's a masculine thing to be interested in women, then you would consider a man being interested in men transgender behavior. On the other hand, we are more enlightened now. We don't think that it is necessarily masculine to be interested in women and feminine to be interested in men. So these days, that's not considered to be transgender behavior. But it's really a matter of how the idea of gendered behavior has changed over time in some cases.
Transgender people are often combined into a group called LGBT, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. Now, the first three are all sexual orientation. So it seems like the transgender is a bit like a separate thing.
There are some people who would rather they be separate on both sides. But really, what brings us together is that the people that have problems with gay and lesbian and bisexual people also have similar problems with trans people most of the time, and vice versa. And they don't really make the distinction. So there's a kind of shared oppression. And in fact, you'll often see that the lesbians who get the most flack are the butch lesbians. And, you know, maybe I'm sure that femme lesbians have, you know, their problems too, but butch lesbians and feminine men are often the people who get the brunt of the discrimination.
Right.
So there is a gender component to how the rest of the world reacts to all of these people.
I know about 4 transgender people, and they're all trans women. So they are originally were men, and now are women. And they all seem to, after they've transitioned to being a woman, are in relationships with other women. So is it true that most people who transgender to women are now lesbians?
No, it's, well, I couldn't say is it more or less than half, I don't know. It is true that all the possible combinations that you can think of happen.
So let's talk about your experiences figuring out that being a man was not for you. How old do you think you were when you realized something was amiss?
I can think back to maybe, there were definitely hints by the time I was 10 or 11. I think sometime when I was in high school, I saw an article in the newspaper about Renee Richards, who was a trans woman and became rather famous for her for being in professional tennis. And I remember reading that article and thinking that she was like me. I read a lot about trans people in the medical library when I was in college.
Okay.
That was a little distressing because I was reading, the psychological papers and things for doctors, and it made being trans seem very scary and off-putting. It's actually a lot nicer than medical papers in the 80s described it.
Okay.
In some sense, I wasn't sure until I actually started to transition.
So you started transitioning before you were actually sure that was what you wanted?
I took a good guess. And I think that's pretty much all anybody can do. I was almost 30.
Almost 30,
Yeah.
okay. So I've heard news articles. There's actually a news article about a 6-year-old who wanted to transgender, and I think it was a boy who wanted to be a girl. And I was wondering if, at that early age, do you think it's possible to know that you want to be transgender? Like, could you be confused? Maybe you're gay? Like, do you think they can know at that age?
It's very hard to be sure what you want to be when you grow up. If you'd asked me when I was 6 whether I wanted to be a mathematician when I grew up, I might have said yes. I think the same thing applies to gender. Even young, some people can take a good guess, other people are less sure. What people do when this happens is they do transition socially and see what it's like to live the other gender.